Welcome to the show. And please tell me where you're watching this video. Leave your reply in the comments below. A landlocked nation has become the loudest drum on the continent, without winning an election night, without marching an army across a single border, without asking anyone's permission. And that is exactly why the danger feels so close. Because when a people stop begging, when they start speaking in the language of dignity, the old order does not merely argue back. It watches. It waits. It looks for the pressure points inside the palace, inside the barracks, inside the story itself. In Burkina Faso, the name Thomas Sankara still carries the electricity of a brief, blazing season, proof that leadership can feel like a revolution rather than a routine. And now, Ibrahim Traoré is being spoken of as a return of that spirit. A young captain turned symbol, celebrated by many as the face of a new Sahel awakening, and criticized by others as an unconstitutional interruption. But here is the hinge in history. Symbols do not only inspire, symbols also attract enemies. So tonight we will follow the thread carefully, facts first, separating what is confirmed from what is claimed, and asking the question that hangs in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Who benefits if this symbol is broken? Do not look away. This is more than a headline. Subscribe now and stay with us as we trace the road from Sankara's legacy to the Sahel's new revolution. To understand why today's Burkina Faso feels like a spark in dry grass, you have to begin with an earlier fire. In 1983, a young officer named Thomas Sankara seized power in what was then called Upper Volta. The act was political, yes, but the message was psychological. He changed the country's name to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. And in that single renaming, he tried to rewrite the posture of a nation, from bent-back dependency to straight-spined self-respect. The transcript frames this period as short, dramatic, and unforgettable, so vivid that Sankara became more than a leader. He became an icon. Then came 1987. Sankara was killed, and the speaker states that one of those involved was a close compatriot, Blaise Compaoré, adding that this is in the public domain. The lesson offered is as old as power itself. Revolutions rarely die, only from outside pressure. Sometimes the bite comes from inside the clothing you wear. That history matters, because the script argues that symbols have a habit of returning, especially when the ground is ready. Fast forward to 2022. In January, the elected government of Rochmark Christian Kabore was overthrown. The transcript attributes part of the justification to a failure to contain an Islamic insurgency in the northern part of the country. That single line is important for the story's logic, because it introduces the modern dilemma of the Sahel. When insecurity spreads, legitimacy becomes fragile. When legitimacy becomes fragile, the state becomes negotiable. But January was not the end of the upheaval. In September 2022, the administration that had removed Kabore, led by Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, was itself overthrown. The script names Captain Ibrahim Traoré as the figure who emerged from that second rupture, along with colleagues. And it argues that the poster boy moment came quickly, not because 3 years is long, but precisely because 3 years is short. In a nation's life, the first days after a jolt can feel like destiny. People read meaning into gestures. They listen harder to tone than to policy. They measure the future by whether a leader sounds like the past they wish they had kept. The transcript suggests that what made Traoré instantly magnetic was the language of separation, an insistence that the country had remained a neo-colonial state for too long, and that the old ties, especially with France, had to be cut. Where Sankara's era was defined by refusal and self-reliance, Traoré is depicted as echoing that cadence. If the resources are ours, then the benefit must be ours. If the soil is ours, then hunger should not be ours. The script also points to practical themes: agriculture to feed the people, control over national resources, and a governing posture that places national interest above external approval. Missing specific official decrees, dates, or published policy documents are not provided in the transcript, so these claims should be sourced before being stated as confirmed facts. Then the narrator widens the lens to the mood of a continent. The story claims that many Africans, particularly younger people, had been persuaded that democracy as defined by the West was the gold standard, only to experience elections that felt hollow. Ballots that did not translate into better living conditions, leaders who did not serve, and political systems that appeared designed to recycle the same elites. Whether one agrees with that framing or not, it is the emotional engine of this script, a belief that the ballot became a ritual without rescue. And when rituals fail, people start searching for drama. That is where the script makes a bold move. It turns a chain of coups into a narrative of political and ideological transformation. It argues that citizens are not cheering the gun as a weapon. They are cheering the gun as a door slammed shut on a class of leaders they believe perfected manipulation, corruption, and stagnation. It is a dangerous sentiment because it can excuse anything, but it is a sentiment the transcript treats as real and widespread. This is also where the story begins to set its stakes. The speaker reminds us that, in the eyes of institutions like the African Union, a military takeover fits the category of an unconstitutional change of power. The transcript references the Malabo Protocol of 2014 and later positions, arguing that the continental framework condemns coups and related constitutional tampering. That matters because it frames Traoré's rise as both celebrated and condemned. A hero in the street, a problem in the boardroom, and that contradiction celebration below. Suspicion above is exactly what turns a leader into a symbol. A symbol is powerful because it compresses a complicated reality into a single face. But a symbol is also vulnerable for the same reason. When hope is concentrated into one person, the person becomes a pressure valve for the whole society. If he delivers, the legend grows. If he stumbles, the disappointment multiplies. And if he is removed by politics, by violence, or by betrayal, the shockwaves travel far beyond one capital city. The transcript is not simply telling the story of a captain. It is building the case that the Sahel is a crossroads, a region where sovereignty is no longer whispered, but shouted, where trade is demanded instead of pity, where dignity is treated as a policy, not a poem. Yet the louder the shout becomes, the more the old order listens not to applaud, but to calculate. Because the moment a symbol rises high enough to be seen from far away, someone, somewhere, starts asking a cold question. And once that question is asked, who benefits? If the symbol is broken, the story stops being a biography and becomes a battlefield. If task 1 is the spark, task 2 is the wind. Because what follows a coup is never just a change of uniforms. It is a struggle over interpretation, over whether the world will call it a rupture, a rescue, or a crime. And in this script, that struggle unfolds on 3 stages at once: the street, the institution, and the echo chamber. On the street, the transcript describes a continent-wide exhaustion with what it calls the ballot. The speaker's argument is blunt. People were told that multi-party elections, periodic voting, and Western-style institutions were the alpha and omega of good governance. Yet in many places, so the claim goes, the ballot delivered leaders who did not deliver. Votes were stolen, outcomes were predetermined, and the winners treated office like a private inheritance rather than a public trust. Whether every part of that indictment is fair is not the key point here. The key point is the feeling, a feeling of betrayal. And betrayed people do not merely want reform. They want drama. They want change that looks like change. So the transcript frames the rise of Traoré as a collision between despair and daring. A young officer appearing at the exact moment many citizens felt they had run out of peaceful levers. It is not an endorsement of coups. It is a diagnosis of why coups become popular. They wanted sound rhetoric, the speaker says. They wanted Pan-African rhetoric. And Traoré, in this telling, speaks in chords that match the hunger, sovereignty, dignity, refusal, self-reliance. Then comes the second stage, the institutions. The script invokes the Malabo Protocol of 2014, describing it as a continental attempt to outlaw unconstitutional changes of power, and to define them acquiring power by a coup, refusing to hand over power after losing elections, tampering with constitutional processes to extend time in office. It also mentions, later, AU positions and a 2022 declaration that reiterated those principles. The conclusion the speaker draws is clear. To your typical African leader and to the African Union, Traoré's rise is classified as illegitimate, and that is why, according to the transcript, Burkina Faso, alongside Mali and Niger, was suspended from O activities. Missing. The transcript does not provide exact dates, documents, or communiques for the suspension claim, so this should be verified before being stated as confirmed fact. Now the story hits its paradox. Why would ordinary people celebrate what institutions condemn? The transcript answers with an accusation and a lament. It argues that citizens have watched so-called democratically elected leaders become corrupt, ant-people, or worse. It paints a picture of presidents who manipulate rules to stay indefinitely, delivering little while demanding patience. In that environment, the script claims, a military takeover is rebranded in the public mind, not as a theft, but as a purge. The language shifts from unconstitutional change to rebellion, then to revolution. And the crowd does what crowds do. When they believe the door has finally opened, it dances. The speaker lists cities, Niamey, Bamako, Ouagadougou, and describes people celebrating in the streets. Again, the transcript offers this as a broad observation rather than a sourced report, but it functions as a narrative beat. The applause is not local, it is regional. The Sahel's political tremors are presented as a collective mood. Then we reach the third stage, the media and the algorithm. The transcript makes a striking claim. Social media is populated with a lot of artificial intelligence, things attributed to Traoré, and they are all positive. The speaker reads this not as deception, but as a symptom of something deeper, what they call a hunger for positive messaging. When people feel surrounded by bad news and bad governance, they grasp for a voice that sounds clean, decisive, and unbought. The symbol becomes a lighthouse. And the algorithm, seeing attention, pours fuel on the fire. Here the script escalates into its emotional peak. Traoré is compared to a figure expected to perform miracles. The speaker reaches for biblical imagery. Moses parting seas, manna falling from heaven, pillars of fire standing between a people and their enemies. This is not just praise. It is warning, because the higher the expectations climb, the narrower the path becomes. A leader who becomes a savior is no longer judged like a politician. He is judged like a prophecy, and prophecies create enemies. The transcript then introduces the darker undertone. Rumors of attempts on Traoré's life, claims that colonizers act through proxies, fifth columnists, betrayal from within. It draws an explicit historical parallel. Sankara was eliminated through people he thought were friends. Important note for facts. First writing. The transcript does not provide evidence or named sources for specific assassination plots. It is presented as the speaker's allegation and interpretation. Any adaptation into your script must keep that distinction clear, or mark it as still, as storytelling. The effect is undeniable. Once you plant the idea that hope has a target on its back, every disagreement starts to look like a dagger. Every foreign statement looks like a signal. Every internal rival looks like a risk. The story becomes not only about reform, but about survival. And this is where the crescendo tightens into a question with teeth. If a symbol can move millions, who would want that symbol to fall? Is it external powers protecting influence? regional elites protecting comfort, domestic factions protecting privilege? Or is it simply the brutal logic of politics where any rising figure attracts those who fear change? The transcript does not settle the question, it sharpens it. Because in the Sahel's new revolution, where crowds clap, institutions condemn, and algorithms amplify, one truth becomes unavoidable. When a leader becomes a symbol, the fight is no longer only over policy. It is over the future's right to exist. And when the future starts walking, someone always tries to trip it. A revolution is not proved by the day it arrives. It is proved by the mornings after, when the speeches fade, when the market stalls open, when families ask the same old question in a new era: what changed for us? The transcript insists that the Sahel's current wave must be read through this lens. On one side stand institutions and many established leaders, pointing to continental rules and calling the takeovers unconstitutional. On the other side stand citizens tired, disillusioned, and impatient, who look at those same rules and ask whether legality has become a costume worn by failure in that clash. The same event becomes two opposite stories, condemnation above, celebration below. And the consequences of that clash are not abstract. They land in the everyday life of a nation like Kuwait. First, legitimacy becomes a battlefield. When a government's right to rule is questioned by regional bodies, it does not merely lose a stamp of approval, it can lose diplomatic room to breathe. Suspension, isolation, or sanctions, formal or informal, can tighten access to finance, partnerships, and certain types of cooperation. The transcript leans heavily on the idea that outsiders will choke Sahel governments by draining the water from their pond, creating pressure until the people themselves turn against the leadership. Missing. Specific policy actions, sanction regimes, and dates are not provided in the transcript and would need verification before being treated as confirmed. But even as an argument, it points to a real political mechanism. External pressure often seeks internal fracture. Second, security and stability become the permanent test. The script begins with insurgency as part of the justification for January 2022. That means the new order inherits not a blank slate, but a burning house. If insecurity persists, the public patience that once fueled celebration can sour into anger. And insecurity is not only about guns. It is about schools closing, roads becoming risky, farmers abandoning fields, and traders paying invisible taxes to fear. A state can speak the language of dignity, yet still be judged by whether ordinary people can travel, farm, and sleep. Third, the economy becomes the silent referee. The transcript describes Burkina Faso as a small economy, claiming a gross domestic product of slightly over 20 billion United States dollars. Whether that exact figure is accurate is less important here than what it represents: constraint. A small economy cannot buy miracles. It must prioritize, sequence, and withstand shocks. In that context, the transcript highlights areas. It says the administration has focused on agriculture for food, self-sufficiency, education, as long-term investment, and a push to ensure mining benefits the people rather than flowing outward. It also mentions attempts to restructure passports, currency ambitions, and the removal of parasitic institutions. Still, as a narrative of consequences, the logic is clear. The administration's legitimacy is tied to delivery. Pride alone cannot feed a household, but pride can be the spark that makes people endure hardship for a while. Delivery is what turns endurance into trust. Fourth, the politics of symbolism becomes both an asset and a trap. The transcript repeatedly warns that power corrupts and that the public must keep leaders on a short leash. That phrase is more than rhetoric. It is a roadmap for survival. Because when a society places its hopes on a single figure, it risks building a fragile pyramid with one point of failure. The symbol attracts support, but it also attracts opportunists, flatterers, and rival factions. who either want to own the symbol or replace it. The closer the symbol gets to the center of everything, the more every dispute begins to look existential, and that is where systems must step forward. If the promise is sovereignty, then sovereignty must be visible in institutions that outlive individuals. Transparent contracts, accountable security forces, credible courts, and rules that do not depend on who is holding the microphone. If the promise is dignity, then dignity must appear in outcomes, food prices that do not spiral, schools that function, health systems that endure, and public money that can be tracked. Otherwise, the revolution risks becoming a performance staged for the world rather than a harvest grown for the people. For many supporters, Ibrahim Traoré is described not merely as a politician, but as proof that a different posture is possible. But proof must be renewed daily. That is the hard truth of politics. Hope is a loan, and it comes due. So here is a question for you, not a slogan, but a test of judgment. If a leader rises by promising liberation from broken systems, what must the public demand in the first year of consolidation? Results, rules, or both? Because the transcript's final warning in this section is the most important one. Symbols matter, but popular vigilance matters more. A people can celebrate a revolution and still insist on accountability. In fact, if they do not, the very revolution they cheered can become another chapter of disappointment, just with new uniforms and familiar excuses. And that is why the stakes keep rising. Because when delivery becomes the measure, every crisis becomes a referendum, every hardship becomes a weapon. Every internal disagreement becomes an opening, and the moment a symbol is tested by hardship, the real question arrives. Will the people tighten their unity, or will someone exploit the pressure and break the story from the inside? Step outside the streets of Ouagadougou, and the story changes tone. From the international viewpoint described in the transcript, the Sahel's upheavals are not treated as poetry or catharsis. They are treated as precedent. The speaker argues that continental institutions, especially the African Union, see military takeovers through a legal and diplomatic frame. Stability, constitutional order, and the fear that one rupture becomes a domino. That is why, in this telling, the language of unconstitutional change of power matters so much. It is not merely a label, it is a tool that can justify suspension, isolation, and a colder kind of engagement. Then comes the regional layer. The transcript stitches together a sequence. Mali in 2021, Burkina in 2022, Niger in 2023, followed by a break with ECOWAS and the ambition to build a new Sahel structure, common arrangements for movement, tariffs, perhaps even currency. Whether each of those plans is fully implemented is not the script's focus. The focus is the symbolism. A region attempting to loosen the grip of the old economic architecture and rewrite the terms of belonging. And in that moment, the world's great contest arrives at the doorstep. The transcript portrays France as the central external antagonist, an old power losing influence, reacting with hostility, and attempting to undermine what it cannot control. It even frames this as partly personal, driven by ego and wounded prestige. That is strong rhetoric, but again, it is interpretation, not documented evidence in the transcript. It should be presented as such in a facts-first adaptation. Against that pressure, the speaker positions Russia as the attractive alternative. Historically not a colonizer in Africa, seen as a supporter during anti-colonial struggles, and most importantly useful in a world described as the law of the jungle, where security often depends on having an ally your enemy respects. This is the strategic argument at the heart of the script. Partnerships are not chosen only for ideals. They are chosen for survival. But here is the tighter truth the transcript itself hints at. Every partnership has interests. The question is not whether partners have motives, they always do. The question is whether the relationship is built as a short-term shield around leaders, or as long-term structures that outlast leaders. That is why the speaker argues the relationship must go beyond individuals, so that, decades from now, it still functions as mutual advantage rather than personal loyalty. In this geopolitical tug-of-war, Burkina Faso becomes more than a country. It becomes a message. And messages trigger reactions. Diplomatic pressure, media campaigns, economic constraints, and the quiet attempt to separate a government from its own people. So the international lens is not just about who is right, it is about who can endure. Because if external pressure can turn daily hardship into public anger, the decisive battle may not be fought at borders at all, only in the hearts of citizens who must choose between patience and protest. Revolutions love the moment of arrival, but nations are built in the quieter season that follows, when slogans must turn into schedules and courage must learn the discipline of details. The transcript describes the past years in the Sahel as an era of disruption. Old arrangements shaken, old loyalties questioned, old permissions withdrawn. Yet it also suggests a turning point, moving from the shock of change into the harder work of consolidation. And consolidation is where many movements stumble, because it demands something less glamorous than defiance: institution building. If the promise is sovereignty, then sovereignty must be engineered. That means food systems that reduce dependence, not through speeches, but through seeds, storage, transport, and markets that function even when headlines turn hostile. It means education that prepares young people for the world as it is. Technology, industry, modern skills, so that pride is backed by capacity. It means mining and resources, managed with transparent contracts and visible public benefit, so that value does not leave the soil only to return as charity. Trade over aid is not a chant, it is a supply chain. But the road ahead is not only economic, it is political. The transcript offers a warning as sharp as any weapon. Power can corrupt. The same crowd that cheers a savior today can become the crowd that mourns betrayal tomorrow. Because when hope is placed too heavily on one figure, disappointment becomes heavier still. This is why the speaker insists on accountability, popular vigilance, and the idea that leaders must be kept close to the people, not elevated above them. A symbol can ignite a movement, but only systems can sustain it. And that brings us to the hardest test: security without paranoia. The transcript speaks of insurgency, external hostility, and internal fifth columnists. In a volatile environment, the temptation is to see every critic as an enemy and every question as sabotage. But a revolution that treats scrutiny as treason will eventually eat its own credibility. The safer path is to protect the state without strangling public trust, strengthening security while preserving transparent governance, so that discipline does not become fear. Then there is the geopolitical balancing act. The script highlights partnerships, especially with Russia as a strategic shield, but it also implicitly acknowledges a risk. Dependency can change its flag without changing its nature. If the goal is dignity, partnerships must be structured so that national interest remains the compass, not foreign rivalry. Friendship must be built into institutions, agriculture projects, energy transfers, training frameworks, fair commercial terms so that relationships survive, leadership changes, and cannot be easily turned into personal leverage. So what does the road ahead look like? In the language of the transcript, it looks like a seed planted in stubborn soil. It looks like calloused hands refusing to wait for permission. It looks like a harvest that takes time measured, not in applause, but in stability, bread, schools, and contracts that do not leak a nation's future away. And it looks like a choice, to remain a symbol or to become a system. Because history will not remember the loudest speech. It will remember whether the promise became policy, whether the revolution became ordinary life, where ordinary people can live free. And now we reach the edge of the story. If symbols can be targeted and systems can be sabotaged, what must a people protect first? The leader they love, or the institutions that can outlive him? In the end, this story is not a thriller about one man. It is a mirror held up to a continent. Because Africa's struggle for sovereignty has never been only about flags or anthems. It has been about the right to decide what is grown in our soil, what is built on our roads, what is taught in our classrooms, and what is valued in our markets. It is about trade that creates strength, not aid that creates dependence. It is about dignity that can be measured not by applause, but by whether a child can eat, learn, and dream without fear. That is why symbols matter. They give a scattered hope, a single face. But symbols alone cannot carry a nation to safety. A symbol can ignite the fire, yet only systems can keep it from burning the house down. Real independence is not a moment. It is a structure, transparent contracts, accountable security, institutions that do not collapse when one leader leaves the stage. It is a population that remains vigilant, supporting bold leadership while demanding proof day after day that power is held in trust. So when the question is asked, who would benefit if a rising symbol were broken, we should widen our answer. Anyone who profits from instability benefits. Anyone who prefers Africa divided, dependent, and permanently negotiating from weakness benefits. Anyone who wants the Sahel to be a warning sign rather than a blueprint benefits. The target is not only the person, the target is the possibility. And that is exactly why the next chapter cannot be written by fear. If Africa is to move from disruption to harvest, the people must protect what outlives personalities, rules that bind leaders, systems that serve citizens, and economies that keep value at home. The future cannot be outsourced, and it cannot be postponed. So here are the questions I want to leave you with, because your judgment is part of the story's outcome. Do you believe Ibrahim Traoré represents a genuine continuation of Sankara's revolutionary spirit? Or is the continent placing its hopes in another powerful symbol without the safeguards that protect nations from disappointment? And how can Africans defend leaders who challenge neo-colonial systems while ensuring that accountability never becomes optional? Tell us what you think. Speak with honesty. Speak with respect. And if this conversation matters to you, do not keep it to yourself. Subscribe, share this video, and leave your comment. Because history is not only made by those who lead, but by those who refuse to stay silent. Remember, Burkina Faso is not just a place on a map today. It is a question being asked aloud. And whether that question becomes a harvest or a heartbreak depends on what comes next.